past president of the International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War, and that organization, due in large part to his efforts, was recipient of the 1985 Nobel Peace Prize. He's co-founder and past president and resuscitator of Physicians for Social Responsibility, which is the U.S. affiliate of the IPPNW. He's a member of the International Steering Group of the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, ICAN, and played a large role in the 2017 award of a Nobel Peace Prize to that organization. He's represented ICAN at historic intergovernmental meetings to address the humanitarian aspects of nuclear war and at key UN and other assemblies that have led to successful assemblage of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. He's a recipient of numerous leadership awards. He's published scientific vetted material on the medical consequences of nuclear war in the New England Journal of Medicine, the British Med Journal, the Lancet, the World Medical Journal, and has delivered countless lectures around the world. He was educated at Harvard and the Albert Einstein College of Medicine, is a former longtime practicing urgent care doctor and retired internist, and has quite a lot to say to us. Thank you.
Thanks, Terry. I want to thank the First Unitarian Universalist Church for hosting this event and the groups that are co-sponsoring it, but I especially want to thank all of you for coming this afternoon. This, as I'm sure you all know, is not going to be an easy conversation, and I appreciate your giving up your Saturday afternoon to participate in it. I used to actually apologize to people when I was going to speak because the stuff is so difficult to listen to. I've stopped doing that because I now think we only have two choices. We're either going to talk about nuclear war and do something about it, or we're going to have one, which would be even worse. So, but still, I very much appreciate your taking this time today to be part of this conversation. I think there are three things that we need to understand about the nuclear situation today. First, we really can have a nuclear war. This is not something that we worried about in the 1980s that we just read about in history books. This is a real and present danger. Secondly, if it does happen, it's going to be far worse than we can possibly imagine. And third, and perhaps most important, it doesn't have to happen. It's really up to us whether we have this or not. So let me go through these 3 points one at a time. First, why do I say that we really could have a nuclear war? In the 1980s, I think all of us, and there are many people in this room who probably remember this well, we were all terrified that there was going to be a nuclear war. It pervaded our culture. There were movies about nuclear war. There were books about nuclear war. Many of us had nightmares about nuclear war. And as a result of that intense awareness of the problem, people took action. Millions of people in the United States, in Europe, even in the Soviet Union, in Japan, in Australia. And that action played an enormously important role in reversing the arms race at that time. But when the Cold War ended in 1989, 1990, depending how you count it, that understanding really vanished very quickly. I think it was almost a volitional act. We had all lived through this terrible fear, and now suddenly the Cold War was over. We dodged the bullet. We hadn't had a nuclear war, and we were not going to worry about it anymore. And we didn't, as a society, as a civilization. And there was some reason for that. The 1990s were certainly a much safer time than the 1980s had been. But the fundamental problem had not gone away. There were still thousands, tens of thousands of nuclear warheads in the arsenals of the world, sitting there, waiting for things to go bad again. And that, of course, is exactly what's happened. Over the last 15 years, perhaps a little bit longer, relations between the nuclear armed states have deteriorated dramatically, such that in 2018, William Perry, the former Secretary of Defense under President Clinton, warned us that the danger of nuclear war then, in 2018, was greater in his opinion than it had been at any point during the Cold War. Now, he was talking in particular about the relations between the United States and Russia. And so it's important to remind ourselves that he gave us this warning a full 4 years before the second Russian invasion of Ukraine, which has dramatically ramped up the danger of nuclear wars. We have seen with the constant flood of very specific nuclear threats that have flowed from the Kremlin since then. But it's not just the situation between the United States and Russia. U.S.-Chinese relations are the worst they've been since the 1970s. We're engaged in a very tense trade war with China, and there is much potential for this to escalate into military conflict over Taiwan, over navigation of the South China Sea. The situation in Korea, which flared up in 2017 when President Trump and Kim Jong-un traded insults and bragged about who had the bigger button, that seemed to quiet down in 2018 when Trump and Kim held their series of summit meetings. But those meetings failed, and Kim walked away from those failed negotiations convinced that North Korea needed to build up its nuclear arsenal and the missile fleet to deliver those weapons, and that's exactly what he's done. And now South Korea, looking at the failure of the United States to really honor its commitment to defend Ukrainian territorial integrity, is now coming to the conclusion that it may also need nuclear weapons. There's a very strong majority of the South Korean population that now favors the development of their own nuclear weapon. And so the situation there remains extremely dangerous. There's a situation obviously in the Middle East, which is at the forefront at the moment with the US and Israeli attack on Iran. Iran does not have nuclear weapons. It clearly was developing the ability to build them, if not actually building them. And this war has almost certainly redoubled the resolve of the Iranian leadership to pursue the acquisition of nuclear weapons. This is a lesson which we have very stupidly taught them. And then finally, there's a situation in South Asia, which actually is the one that worries me the most. India and Pakistan, between them, have about 350 nuclear warheads. They have fought 4 full-scale wars since they became independent nations in the 1940s. They fought a little mini-war in May of last year, lasted only 3 days. During the course of that war, the Indian Air Force was at times bombing Pakistani Air Force base that housed part of the Pakistani nuclear arsenal. This conflict could easily have escalated into a large-scale war between the two involving nuclear weapons. And as I will describe a little bit later, such a war would have been a disaster, not just for South Asia, but for the entire planet. So 5 geopolitical flashpoints. And I think the best way to sum up this threat is the simple fact that in the last 15 months, 5 of the 9 countries which have nuclear weapons have been actively engaged in warfare. Russia and Ukraine, the United States and Israel against Iran, India and Pakistan against each other. It's a very dangerous situation. Now, in addition to these geopolitical problems, there are 2 other factors that we need to be aware of that are contributing to this situation. The first of these is the climate crisis. And people don't often necessarily think about the climate crisis as a threat multiplier when we're talking about nuclear war, but that's exactly what it is. Even if we do everything that we are supposed to do to try to minimize the climate disruption that we are now experiencing, this process is going to go on. It's going to continue for the next 20 or 30 years. And as that happens, large portions of this planet are going to find themselves unable to support their human population. There's going to be an enormous stress on societies around the world, with conflict within countries as people fight over scarce resources of food and water, with conflict between countries as they fight over scarce resources of food and water. There's going to be migration on a scale that we have never seen in human history. Estimates are it could be 50 to 150 million climate refugees forced to leave their homes because they simply cannot live there anymore. And the world, as we have seen, is not really very good at coping with these kinds of migrations. If nuclear weapons are still on the table as all of this chaos plays out, the chance of nuclear weapons being used is simply going to grow. And finally, there is the rapid evolution of cyber technology, and particularly the development of artificial intelligence, which I think lends an entirely new layer of danger to the current situation. There are some who are saying that artificial intelligence may actually stabilize the situation, decrease the danger of nuclear war. I don't think there's any evidence of that at all. There's much reason to be concerned that these devices which we know hallucinate and make up data, which we know have internal biases, which we know we don't understand, may be making decisions about whether or not to use nuclear weapons. And even if an individual is kept in the loop, that's the phrase that we reassured with, there will always be a human in the loop, the data on which that person is making decisions is all going to be generated by systems which are thoroughly infiltrated by AI. And we simply don't know how this is going to play out, but we're performing this gigantic global experiment, integrating AI into these systems without really understanding what this is going to do. So for all of these reasons, I think we need to understand that nuclear war is indeed not something we read about in history books. It is a huge, looming threat that we need to take into account. And given that, I think it's important for us to remind ourselves of what is going to happen if there is a nuclear war. I want to start by describing what happens to a single city. I should preface this by saying, at some level this seems like a fool's errand. Everybody knows nuclear war is going to be terrible. Why talk about it? Well, I think it's important to talk about it because even though we have this general notion that nuclear war will be terrible, we don't, any of us, begin to understand how bad it's going to be. And it's important that we do that because that's what's going to make us take action. Again, let me start by describing what happens to a single city. Last year, in the Hiroshima and Nagasaki 80th anniversary, most of us, I'm sure, saw pictures of the devastation of those cities in 1945. And they were very powerful reminders, warnings of the damage that nuclear weapons can cause. But the main thing that we need to know about Hiroshima and Nagasaki is that they do not begin to prepare us for what's going to happen if there's a nuclear war today. The Hiroshima bomb had an explosive force of 15 kilotons, 15,000 tons of TNT. Most of the weapons in the US and Russian arsenal have an explosive force of 100 to 800 kilotons. They are 6 to 50 times more powerful than the Hiroshima bomb. And if there is a significant war between the United States and Russia, it's not going to be one Hiroshima-sized bomb on one or two cities. It's going to be many bombs on many cities, each of which are 6 to 50 times more powerful than Hiroshima. We don't know the exact targeting strategy of either the United States or the Russian Federation, but it is generally believed that major cities with significant industrial or military targets in or around them are going to be hit with anywhere from 10 to 15, possibly more nuclear warheads, each of which 6 to 50 times more powerful than Hiroshima. To describe this, I'm going to use the model of a single very large explosion, a 20 megaton bomb. We used to have weapons that big, we don't anymore, because we found out that you cause more damage by using many smaller weapons and spreading them out. The explosive force of this model is actually greater than will probably hit any city. The destruction I'm going to describe is an underestimate, because you do cause more damage by using small weapons and spreading them out. But it puts us in the right ballpark. It gives us a notion of what we're going to be dealing with. Within 1,000th of a second of the detonation of this bomb, a fireball would form, reaching out for 2 miles in every direction, 4 miles across. Within this area, everything would be vaporized. The buildings, the trees, the people, the upper level of the earth itself would disappear. To a distance of 4 miles in every direction, the explosion would generate winds greater than 600 miles per hour. Mechanical forces of that magnitude essentially destroy anything that we can build. This church would be gone. There'd be not a trace left behind. To a distance of 6 miles in every direction, the heat would be so intense that automobiles would melt. And to a distance of 16 miles in every direction, the heat would still be so intense that everything flammable would burn. Paper, cloth, gasoline, wood, plastic, heating oil, it would all ignite. And you would get hundreds of thousands of fires, which over the next half hour would coalesce into a giant firestorm, 32 miles across, covering 800 square miles. Within that entire area, the temperature would rise to 1,400 degrees Fahrenheit. All of the oxygen would be consumed, and every living thing would die. In the case of New York, or Moscow, or Beijing, they're all about the same size. We're talking about 12 to 15 million people dead in half an hour. And if this were part of a large-scale war involving the United States, Russia, China, NATO, this kind of destruction would occur at all the great cities in all the countries fighting this war. The total death toll that first afternoon, 200, 300, perhaps 400 million people. And those who survived in the countries which fought this war would find themselves living in a landscape that we cannot imagine. None of the things that we require to stay alive would be available. There'd be no cell phones, no internet, no electric grid, no food distribution system, no system of law and order, no banking system. In the months following this attack, the vast majority of people in the United States, in Russia, in China, in the NATO countries would also die. They would die from radiation poisoning, from starvation, from exposure to the elements, from epidemic disease. But this is only part of the story. I've only talked about what happens in the countries that actually fight this war. This would be a disaster for the rest of the planet as well. A war between the United States and Russia, using just the weapons currently deployed under the now lapsed New START Treaty, would put 150 million tons of soot into the upper atmosphere, blocking out the sun and dropping temperatures across the planet an average of 18 degrees Fahrenheit. In the interior regions of North America and Eurasia, places like Columbus, the temperatures would drop 45 to 50 degrees Fahrenheit. And this would persist for the best part of a decade. We have not seen conditions on this planet that cold since the last ice age. And under these conditions, most of the ecosystems which have evolved since the end of that ice age would collapse. Food production across the entire planet would essentially stop. And in the first 2 years, according to a study that was published in the summer of 2022, 3/4 of the human race, 6 billion people, would starve to death. The study only looked at the first 2 years. The famine would continue beyond that, and we don't know what the ultimate death toll would be. That same study also looked at what would happen with a smaller war, as might take place between India and Pakistan. And it found that that war could kill up to 100 million people directly, and also trigger a global famine. Not as severe as that following a US-Russia war, but bad enough to kill 2 billion people, a quarter of humanity in the first 2 years, including 130 million people here in the United States. So that's the danger that we face. I didn't make this stuff up. This isn't the plot of a movie. This is the danger we allow ourselves to live with every day that we allow these weapons to continue to exist. And we have to understand that if we do allow these weapons to continue to exist, it's just a question of time. It's not a question of if. It's only a question of when this happens. We are told that deterrence, mutually assured destruction, provides stability in the world, that it guarantees these weapons are used by some magical power. That's a very dangerous myth. We know of at least 6 occasions when either the United States or Russia actually began the process of launching a nuclear attack on the other side, always in the mistaken belief that they were under attack themselves. And on these occasions, it was only at the very last minute that it was discovered that the alarm that they were responding to was a false alarm. We are not here today. We have not survived this far into the nuclear weapons era because we knew what we were doing. It's not because we've always had wise leaders, or sound military doctrine, or infallible technology. I think we need to accept the assessment of former Defense Secretary Robert McNamara. We survived this long because, quoting him, we lucked out. It was luck that prevented nuclear war. And we have to understand, and we have to convince the leadership of the 9 nuclear weapon states that the current policy of maintaining these arsenals is nothing more than a hope for continued good luck. And no one's luck lasts forever, and ours won't either. So that's the bad news, and there's a great deal of it. But there's also some very important good news, which is that none of this has to happen. Nuclear weapons are not a force of nature. It is not as though an asteroid is coming at the planet and there's nothing we can do about it. These are little machines that we built with our own hands. Most nuclear warheads are about the size of the chairs you're sitting in. We've already dismantled more than 50,000 of them since the height of the Cold War. We know exactly how to dismantle the 12,000 that remain. And we could do it in about 3 or 4 years, once the decision were taken to do that. The problem is creating the political will to make that decision. And that's where all of us come in, because this isn't going to happen unless we confront the leadership of our country and citizens in other countries confront their leadership and make them face this reality. They don't want to give up their nuclear weapons. Some of them believe in deterrence. They believe that mutually assured destruction will always work, despite the evidence that it doesn't. But they also, in most cases, are motivated by another consideration, which is that although these weapons don't make us safe at all, they do make the countries that have them strong. They let Russia invade Ukraine and fend off the rest of the world by threat of using nuclear weapons. They let the United States attack Iran with the same kind of threat. And this power is incredibly seductive. They simply do not want to give it up. And we have to convince them that whatever benefit they think they're deriving from having this additional power is not worth the risk. And for many of us, it's a tough sell psychologically. I mean, through most of human history, if you were stronger than your enemy, you were safe. But that logic doesn't apply during the nuclear weapons era, because these weapons are so powerful that they're essentially suicide bombs. If we use our own nuclear weapons in a successful attack against Russia or China, the climate disruption we would cause would kill most of the people here in the United States. And given that, that old logic simply does not apply anymore. These weapons, not only do they not make us safe, but they are the greatest threat to our safety, and our security requires that we eliminate them. It's the highest national security priority. General Lee Butler, who used to command strategic forces back in the early 90s, famously said in the late 90s, there's only one thing in the world the US military cannot protect us from, and that is nuclear weapons in the hands of another country. And so it has to be, I'm still quoting him, our highest national security priority to eliminate those weapons. And the only way we can do it is by willing to give up our weapons too. And that's fine, because if nobody else has them, we don't need them either. That has to be the understanding that we inculcate in our leaders. And we need to build a movement to do that, a movement like the one we were successfully able to build in the 1980s. Now, there is a movement in formation. Here in the United States, it's called the Back from the Brink campaign. This is an offshoot of the international campaign to abolish nuclear weapons. It was launched in 2017 after the UN adopted the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons that ICANN had successfully brought into fruition. That treaty outlaws the possession of nuclear weapons. It outlaws testing nuclear weapons. It outlaws financing nuclear weapons. It outlaws allowing nuclear weapons on a nation's territory. The problem is that while 75 nations have formally joined that treaty and another 25 have signed and indicated they're going to, the 9 nuclear weapon states and their nuclear-dependent allies in NATO, Australia, Japan, and South Korea have not signed the treaty. And so the work now shifts to those of us who live in those countries, and in particular to those living in the United States. We need to build a movement in this country like the Freeze movement of the 1980s. And that's what we're trying to do with the Back from the Brink campaign. We have put forward a platform of what U.S. nuclear policy ought to be, that it needs to be centered on the U.S. beginning negotiations with the other 8 countries which have these weapons, to work out the details of verification and enforcement that would be required, and to work out a timetable for actually eliminating the weapons so they can all join the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. We've taken that prescription along with a number of immediate steps the U.S. could take unilaterally to move in the right direction. We've taken that platform to constituencies around the country. It's been supported by resolutions passed in 70 cities and towns, including some of the largest cities in the country. It's been supported by resolutions passed in 5 state legislatures, and we're hoping that the 6th, Massachusetts, where I live, will join them next week. We have more than 700 NGOs around the country that have endorsed this campaign, including most of the major faith communities, the Episcopal Church, the Presbyterian Church, the Methodist Church, the Congregational Church, the Unitarian Universalist movement, the Reconstructionist Jewish movement, the Islamic Society of North America, Pax Christi in the Catholic community, the Buddhist organization, Soka Gakkai International, many environmental groups, the Sierra Club, 350.org, the NRDC have endorsed this campaign. Labor unions have joined now. Many peace organizations and social organizations and environmental groups locally around the country have joined. We now have a student organization, Students for Nuclear Disarmament, that has chapters on 22 campuses around the country. And there are 27 chapters, hubs we call them, of the campaign itself in cities and towns around the country. We have a resolution in Congress. In the House, it's HRES 317, which has 59 co-sponsors. We have a resolution in the Senate, SRES 323, which has 9 co-sponsors. And we're hoping to add to both of those tallies significantly before the end of the year. We have a long way to go. We are not the freeze in 1982 that brought 1 million people to Central Park. But that's why I'm here talking to you today. We need to build this movement. We don't have a hub here in Columbus. We need one. And I hope that you will all get involved in this work and join a local hub and work to get Congresswoman Beatty to be one of the co-sponsors, get your 2 senators to be co-sponsors, and perhaps get the Columbus City Council to join the other 70 cities around the country in passing a resolution supporting this policy approach. This is a lot of heavy stuff I've dumped on you. And I think it's important to sort of step back for a second and look at the context in which we're doing that, and then I'll wrap up. When we hear that the entire world is at risk, and when we hear and understand that there's something we can do about it, that creates a responsibility. You know, if you see somebody fall down on the street, you can't just walk over them, you have to help them up. If you know that the whole world's at risk, you have to take action. And that can feel like a burden to people, I think. It's a very heavy responsibility. It doesn't sit lightly on your shoulders. But I think there's another way that we need to look at this. Every one of us wants to do something good with our life. Those of us living today have been given the opportunity to save the world. There's nothing better that anyone can ever do with his or her life. And I hope that we can all become active in this campaign with that perspective in mind. I was raised in the Jewish tradition. In the Hebrew Bible, there is a passage where it's reported that God said, "Behold, I have set before you life and death. Therefore choose life, so that you and your children can live." That is literally the choice before all of humanity today. So let us choose wisely. Let us act with courage and with determination. And let us save the world so that our children can live. Thank you.